The day Renata Okafor got down on her knees in the middle of a Canadian Tire parking lot, not to beg, not to pray, but because a 60-pound retriever mix had collapsed and she was the only one who knew what to do, was the same day a man in a pressed golf shirt decided she was the problem. She hadn't planned to stop. It was a Tuesday in late October, the sky that particular shade of bruised gray that settles over Ottawa right before the first hard frost, and Renata had just finished a 12-hour shift at the Civic Hospital. Her scrubs were wrinkled. There was a coffee stain on her left sleeve from around 3 in the morning when she'd misjudged the break room counter in the dark. Her hair, which she'd pinned up at 6 a.m., had mostly given up. She was 29 years old and she felt like 60. All she wanted was windshield washer fluid and maybe a Kit Kat from the checkout lane. The dog was with a man and a woman near the garden center entrance, the seasonal section that in October still held a few sad patio umbrellas and bags of potting soil on clearance. The retriever, a golden color going white around the muzzle, sat on the asphalt beside their dark cart. Then it didn't sit anymore. It went sideways, slow and strange, like something had been pulled out from underneath it, and the woman made a sound that cut right through the parking lot noise. Renata was already moving before she made a conscious decision to move. That was the thing about 7 years of nursing. Your body learned to respond before your brain finished the sentence. She knelt beside the dog, pressed her fingers along its rib cage, watched the shallow, too-fast flutter of its chest. The woman was crying. The man, heavyset, late 50s, red-faced in the way that had nothing to do with the cold, was on his phone, not calling anyone, just holding it like it might help. "What's his name?" Renata asked. "Chester," the woman said. "He's 13. He has a heart thing," the vet said. "Okay, Chester." Renata kept her voice even. She'd used that voice 10,000 times. It was the voice that meant I am not panicking and so you don't have to either. "He's breathing. His gums are pale, but he's breathing. You need to call your vet right now. If they have an after-hours emergency line, use that. If not, there's an animal hospital on Maryville. They're 24 hours. The woman nodded and started dialing. Renata stayed where she was, one hand resting gently on Chester's side, monitoring the rise and fall, watching his eyes. He was scared. Animals always looked scared when their bodies stopped cooperating. She understood that more than she could explain. "Excuse me." She looked up. The man in the golf shirt wasn't the woman's husband. He'd come from somewhere else, from the direction of a silver Lexus parked in the fire lane with its hazards on. He was younger than the couple, maybe late 40s, the kind of tan you maintained on purpose. He wore a shirt with a small logo on the breast pocket and khaki trousers with a crease ironed into them, which struck Renata as a strange thing to notice, but she noticed it anyway. "You can't block the entrance like this," he said. Renata looked around. They were at least 20 feet from the door. "Sir, there's an animal in distress. I can see that." His tone was the particular kind of patient that isn't patient at all. "But you're creating a hazard. People are trying to get through." There was no one trying to get through. There were a few people stopped at a polite distance watching, the way Canadians do, close enough to be witnesses, far enough to preserve deniability. "I'll move as soon as this dog is stable," Renata said. She turned back to Chester. "Are you a vet?" "No. Then I'm not sure what you think you're doing." She felt the heat move up the back of her neck. The particular heat of being talked to like you are both incompetent and inconvenient simultaneously. "I'm a registered nurse," she said, not because she thought it would make a difference, but because it was true and she was tired and sometimes you just say true things. He made a sound. Not quite a laugh. "Something in the same neighborhood. Right. A nurse. Helping a dog. The principles aren't that different," she said flatly. "Look." He crouched down slightly, not to help, just to get to her level, which felt deliberate. "I have a delivery I'm waiting on, and your little scene here is?" "My little scene." She turned and looked at him fully for the first time, the way she looked at a patient who was getting combative, steady, and without blinking. "There is an elderly dog having a cardiac event in front of us. His owner is on the phone trying to get him help. I am monitoring his breathing. This is not a scene. This is a medical situation. For a dog, yes," she said. "For a dog, who matters to the person crying next to me?" He stood back up, straightened his shirt. She could see him deciding something. "I'm going to get the manager," he said, as if that were a threat that had weight to it, as if the manager of a Canadian Tire had jurisdiction over parking lot emergencies. Good idea, Renata said, and looked back at Chester. Chester's breathing had steadied slightly, still shallow, but more regular. His eyes tracked up to her face and stayed there, which she chose to interpret as trust. The vet clinic answered. The woman, her name was Paulette, Renata would learn later, though she hadn't thought to ask yet, was given instructions: keep him still. Keep him warm. Bring him in as soon as possible. They'd be waiting. Paulette's husband Marcus appeared from inside the store where he'd gone to pay, took one look at the situation, stripped off his jacket, and laid it over Chester's hindquarters without being asked. The man in the golf shirt came back. He had not, apparently, gone to get the manager. He'd just repositioned himself near the entrance, arms folded, watching with the expression of someone who'd been personally wronged by the universe and was keeping careful score. A small crowd had gathered. Proper now, not the polite Canadian hovering from before. Someone in a veteran's cap. A woman with a double stroller who'd stopped and was watching quietly. A teenage boy who'd taken his earbuds out. Renata was aware of them. She was also aware of how she must look, kneeling on cold asphalt in wrinkled scrubs with her hair coming down, no credentials visible, no context provided. Just a young woman in blue making a fuss over a dog. She'd long ago made peace with how she appeared to people. Or she thought she had. Someone should tell her to move. The man in the golf shirt said to no one in particular, loud enough to carry. She's not even qualified to do anything. Nurses don't treat animals. The woman with the double stroller looked at him. She's keeping him calm until the vet gets here. What exactly would you prefer she do? Not block the entrance. There's 6 feet of clearance on either side of her. He didn't answer that. Renata focused on Chester. She counted his respirations. She thought about the drive home, 40 minutes in traffic, and the leftover soup she had in the fridge. She thought about her brother Kofi's voice on the phone last Sunday saying you need to take better care of yourself. Ren and she'd laughed because when exactly was she supposed to do that? Between hour 11 and hour 12? Can I do something? The voice was close and low, and she looked up. He was tall. She registered that first because he was crouching beside her and still at eye level, easily 6'3" when standing. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark canvas jacket, but he held himself the way certain people held themselves, with a stillness that didn't read as relaxed so much as ready. Beside him, sitting perfectly still on the asphalt, was a Belgian Malinois wearing a vest. The dog's eyes moved in slow arcs across the parking lot. Alert. Practiced. "Are you with the military?" she asked. "Former." He said it simply, without preamble or performance. "Master Corporal Theo Rask, CAF. Retired." He nodded toward the dog. "This is Brix. He's retired too." Chester chose that moment to lift his head and look at Brix with an expression of mild elderly interest. "Tell me what you need," Rask said. "I just need him to stay still and stay warm until his people can get him to the clinic." She paused. "You can talk to him if you want." Dogs seem to settle when someone's talking. He sat down, right on the asphalt, jacket and all, cross-legged, without any of the deliberation most people used when deciding whether to ruin their trousers. He put one large hand very slowly and from the dog's sightline near Chester's face and let him sniff. "Hey, old man," he said quietly. "You're doing all right." Something about the way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so entirely without self-consciousness, made Renata feel the pressure behind her eyes that she'd been carrying for about 6 hours. She blinked it back. She was not going to cry in a Canadian Tire parking lot over a golden retriever who wasn't even hers. "This is ridiculous," said the man in the golf shirt. Rask looked up. He didn't say anything. He just looked, with the mild, attentive expression of a person who has done things that make parking lot confrontations very small in comparison. The man in the golf shirt looked away first. The clinic was 11 minutes away. A young woman in scrubs who introduced herself as Dr. Hartley met them at the door. She'd been called ahead, had the treatment room ready. Chester was lifted into Marcus's arms and carried inside. Paulette was still crying, but in the relieved way now, not the terrified way. Different entirely. Renata stood up. Her knees ached. The cold had gotten all the way through her scrubs to her skin while she wasn't paying attention. "Thank you," Paulette said to her, grabbing her hand with both of hers. "I don't even know your name, Renata. He's going to be okay." She didn't know that for certain, but she believed it, which was sometimes the same thing. "Call the clinic in a few hours if you don't hear." They went inside. Rask was standing nearby, Brix sitting precisely at his left knee. He handed her a coffee, She hadn't even seen where it came from. Someone must have brought it out from the Tim Hortons next door. You didn't have to stay, she said. Neither did you. She accepted the coffee. It was black, which was exactly how she took it, though he had no way of knowing that. She chose to take it as a sign. Okafor, she said, offering her name properly. Renata Okafor. Civic Hospital. I know, he said. She raised an eyebrow. You're on the fundraising poster in the waiting room. Palliative care wing. He paused. My father was there. Last spring, she absorbed that. The palliative care waiting room had those posters, staff pictures paired with small quotes. She'd forgotten her own was up. She almost never went into that waiting room. She always came out through the ward. I'm sorry, she said, about your father. He was ready. It was a good death. He said that without flinching, and she respected it enormously, because she knew what a good death looked like, and she knew how rare it was, and she knew how hard the people left behind had to work to be able to call it that. Bricks was his idea, Rask said, looking down at the dog. He kept saying I needed something that required daily maintenance, something that would get me out of the house. Smart man. Very. He paused. He'd have liked what you just did. The parking lot had mostly cleared. The silver Lexus was gone from the fire lane. The man in the golf shirt had apparently found somewhere else to stage his grievances. That man was unpleasant, Renata said, because she was tired and tired people said the real thing. Yes. Rask didn't elaborate. He also didn't say he didn't mean it, or people are stressed, or any of the smoothing over things people said. He just agreed plainly, because it was plain. She drank her coffee. He stood beside her and let her drink it, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary, which was one of the rarest things she'd encountered in another human being. Where are you parked? He asked eventually. North lot. The far end. We'll walk you. She looked at Bricks, who had the self-possessed expression of a dog who had walked many people to many places and was prepared to do it again. Okay, she said. She thought about it on the drive home. Not about Rask, exactly. Not about him as a person, but about the shape of what had happened. The man in the golf shirt. The way her explanation had landed on him and slid off, like she'd spoken in a language he'd decided ahead of time not to understand. Nurses don't treat animals. As if there were a strict taxonomy of caring, and she'd violated it. She'd been a nurse for 7 years. She'd worked pediatrics, then emerge, then moved to palliative care, because she'd realized she was good at it, and also because she felt, in the way you feel things you can't entirely explain, that someone ought to be. She'd held the hands of people whose families weren't there. She'd stayed past the end of shifts because she couldn't leave someone alone at the particular moment they were at. She'd learned to carry these things home without breaking down in the parking lot, which took longer to learn than any clinical skill she'd been formally taught. She was also 29, and she drove a 2016 Civic with a dent in the rear bumper from a parking garage pillar in 2021 that she kept meaning to fix, and she lived in a one-bedroom in Centertown with a rubber plant that was doing better than expected, and a collection of novels on her nightstand that she hadn't touched in 4 months. She was not impressive looking. She knew that. She had the kind of face that people described as nice, and she'd long ago understood that nice was a word people used when they couldn't locate anything striking. She was medium height, medium build, kept her lokes pinned up for work, and let them fall loose on days off. She wore small gold hoops and no other jewelry. She moved quietly in the world. She had also, in the past 7 years, talked more than 30 families through the death of someone they loved. Had caught things in triage that the residents missed. Had once performed CPR for 11 minutes on a man in the parking garage until the paramedics arrived, and he'd lived and she'd never seen him again. People like the man in the golf shirt would never know any of that. They saw the scrubs and the tired face, and they made their calculation, and that was that. She didn't need them to know. She never had. But sometimes, on days like this one, when she'd been awake since 5 and the cold had gotten through to her bones, sometimes she just felt it more. She went back on Thursday. Not for him. She needed the washer fluid, and also she'd been thinking about Chester the way she always thought about patients she didn't get to follow up on. Wondering how the story ended. Paulette was at the service desk. She'd driven over to return a hardware item, she explained, and she'd recognized Renata's car, the dented Civic, apparently, and waited on the off chance. Chester was recovering. Cardiac episode, as Renata had suspected, but manageable with new medication. He was home. He'd eaten breakfast. Paulette told her all of this with the compressed intensity of someone who has been worrying for 2 days and needed to release the pressure somewhere. Renata listened and felt the small, clean satisfaction of a thing resolved. "You were so calm," Paulette said. "I kept thinking afterward. You'd just worked a full night, you could see that, and you just stopped. You didn't even hesitate." "I didn't really think about it," Renata said honestly. "I know. That's what I mean." She bought the washer fluid. She got a Kit Kat from the checkout lane, which felt like completing something that had been left open. In the parking lot, she found a note tucked under her windshield wiper. Not the threatening kind. No one had dinged her car, or if they had, she couldn't tell with the existing dent, but a folded receipt and on the back, a phone number, and underneath it, in straightforward handwriting that matched its owner, Theo Rask. "In case you want to know how the story ends, or start a new one." She stood in the October parking lot and held the note. She thought about the way he'd sat down on the asphalt. No deliberation, just sat. The way he'd talked to an old dog in a calm and honest voice. The way he'd handed her a coffee and not required her to explain herself. She took out her phone. She texted the number. "This is Renata Okafor. Chester is recovering. I got my washer fluid." 3 minutes later. "Good to hear on both counts. Brick says hello." She smiled at her phone in a parking lot in Ottawa, in the gray light of late October, with windshield washer fluid in one hand and a Kit Kat in the other. They had coffee the following Saturday. Then dinner the week after. Then he showed up at the hospital at the end of a Friday night shift. Not to make a gesture, just because she'd mentioned she usually couldn't find parking close to the entrance at that hour, and he had the kind of vehicle with clearance for the back lot, and he didn't see why she should walk that far in the dark. He didn't explain any of this as romantic. He explained it as practical. She'd stopped being fooled by that distinction about 3 weeks in. She met Bricks properly. They went to Mooney's Bay on a Sunday when the paths were quiet, and Bricks moved along the river with the precise, pleasurable energy of a dog who had been trained for the demanding work and was now applying those skills to leisure, which he found equally worthy of effort. He sniffed the geese. He regarded a Labrador puppy with the patient condescension of a PhD student watching someone discover the alphabet. He pressed his nose briefly against Renata's hand, and she felt unreasonably honored. "He likes you," Rask said. "He's being professional. With Bricks, those are sometimes the same thing." She laughed. She realized, walking by the river with the cold coming off the water and the leaves down to their last red and gold, that she'd laughed more in 3 weeks than in the preceding 4 months. She wasn't sure what to do with that information, so she tucked it away and kept walking. His unit had a tradition. She learned about it sideways, the way she learned most things about him. Not from speeches, but from small, accreted facts. Every November, the men and women he'd served with gathered somewhere. Rotating host, rotating city, and caught up, ate badly, stayed up too late. He'd been going for 8 years. He hadn't planned to take anyone this year. Then he asked her. "It's in Winnipeg," he said, as if that were the part that might require convincing. "I've been to Winnipeg in November, once. There's a good museum." "There's a very good museum," he agreed, with the seriousness of a man who had opinions about museums. "You'd have to meet about 30 people, some of whom have terrible manners." "I work in a hospital," she said. "That's less alarming than it sounds." She understood, on the flight to Winnipeg, that she was nervous in a way she hadn't been nervous about something in a long time. Not the constant low-level management of difficult situations that she did every day at work. That was a different thing, a professional gear she'd learned to run in. This was the other kind. The kind where what happens actually matters to you personally, and you can't manage it to a neutral outcome. She looked out the window at the prairies coming up beneath them, flat and immense, the late November fields pale as old paper. Rask was reading something. He'd noticed her looking out the window and had not asked her what she was thinking, which she took as further evidence that he understood things about people. The gathering was at a teammate's house in the south end of the city, a wide bungalow with a pickup truck in the driveway and lights on in every room. There were cars parked along both sides of the street for half a block. Someone had put a wreath on the front door, though it was early for Christmas, and she thought it might have been the sort of household that simply left it up from the year before and no one mentioned it. She was introduced as Renata and as a nurse and as someone who'd helped a dying dog in a parking lot in Ottawa, which turned out to be the most effective introduction anyone had ever given her in a social situation because it immediately generated 11 different stories from 11 different people about their own dogs. And within 20 minutes, she had been thoroughly absorbed into the room. She met a woman named Sergeant Cass Delaney, who was built like a competitive swimmer and had the most precise way of cutting to the essential point in any story that Renata had ever encountered. She met a couple whose names she kept mixing up despite being good with names, which was embarrassing. She met an older man, a retired warrant officer named Gord, who sat in the kitchen for the entire evening with the deliberate contentment of someone who has decided the kitchen is the correct place to be, and who talked to her for 45 minutes about Northern Ontario walleye fishing with such genuine enthusiasm that she became, involuntarily, interested in walleye fishing. Brix lay under the kitchen table for most of the evening, tracking the room with his eyes and periodically resting his chin on the foot of whoever had been standing in one place too long, which was his way. Renata had come to understand of saying, "Sit down, you've earned it." She was standing near the back door with a glass of wine and a plate of something someone had described as a Winnipeg thing, when the conversation beside her shifted, as conversations did after a certain hour, toward the harder ground. Sergeant Delaney was talking about a rotation, about something that had gone sideways. The language was specific in some places and carefully general in others, and Renata listened and understood that she was being allowed to hear something that had weight to it, and she listened accordingly. The civilians on that side of it, Delaney was saying, they'd look at us the same way people sometimes look at you, I think. Like they'd already decided what we were before we got there. Renata nodded. She thought about parking lots. The trick, Delaney said, looking at her directly, is you can't spend too much energy on those people. You've got to put it somewhere useful. I know, Renata said. I figured you did. Rask appeared beside her at some point, not intrusively, just materially, the way he entered spaces. He didn't put his arm around her or do anything declarative. He just stood close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and that was its own kind of thing entirely. Gord wants to know if you've ever ice fished, he said. No, he'd like to fix that. I've now spent 45 minutes being interested in fishing I wasn't previously interested in. I think I have to see where it goes, he smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It was the kind that moved in around the eyes more than the mouth, and she'd learned, in 2 months, that those were the real ones. The evening ended gradually, the way those evenings do, with groups thinning and coats being found and someone washing dishes in the kitchen who refused to let anyone help. Renata helped anyway. Delaney dried. He's been different, Delaney said neutrally, keeping her eyes on a glass. Different how? Better different. She set the glass down. After his daddy went quiet. Quieter than usual, I mean. We all knew he'd carry it alone if he could. He's built that way. She looked at Renata. He doesn't seem like he's carrying it alone anymore. Renata didn't know what to say to that, so she washed another glass and handed it over. I'm not trying to make you responsible for him, Delaney said. He can manage himself. She paused, searched for the right thing. I'm just telling you it registers. What you do, to the people around you, even when you think it doesn't. Renata thought about that on the way back to the hotel. Rask drove, and she watched the city go by, the streets empty and orange-lit, the kind of cold outside that made the windows fog along the bottom edges. What did Cass say to you? He asked. Things. She says things to everyone. Good things, Renata said. She said good things. He looked over at her briefly, then back at the road. She's right about most things, he said. In my experience, I'm getting that sense they drove for a while. Brix was in the back seat, asleep with his chin on his paws, his vest off, his breathing slow and even. The heater ran. The city moved past. Renata, he said, and she liked the way he said her full name, always her full name, never a shortened version, as though he'd decided it was the correct amount of syllables and saw no reason to reduce it. I'm glad you stopped. In the parking lot. She thought about October, the cold asphalt, Chester's eyes tracking up to her face and staying there. I'm glad you sat down, she said. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She didn't know. That Tuesday in October, kneeling in a parking lot in wrinkled scrubs with her hair coming down, that this was how things started. She wasn't looking for a start. She was looking for washer fluid and a Kit Kat and the drive home. But she'd stopped. Because the dog needed someone to stop, and she was someone, and she knew how. That was, she thought later, months later, in a kitchen in Ottawa on a Saturday morning, with coffee and bricks asleep in a parallelogram of winter sunlight on the floor, and Rask reading the paper in the way of a person who intended to read the paper for some time. That was probably the only explanation that mattered. Not the scrubs or the hospital or the years of training, though those were all real. Just the stopping, the choosing to stop. The rest followed from that, the way most good things did, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and honestly, the way light changes in a room you've been sitting in long enough to notice.